Finally giving up diversity hire? Garrett Lawson's voice carried across the dormitory like a blade through silk, each word dripping with satisfaction as he watched Sloane Mercer fold her few belongings into a standard-issue duffel bag. The late afternoon California sun streamed through barracks windows, casting long shadows that seemed to emphasize the isolation surrounding the quiet woman who had become their favorite target. Travis Keller and Mason Price flanked Garrett like vultures sensing carrion, their matching grins broadcasting the kind of cruel satisfaction that comes from watching someone finally break under sustained pressure. For 3 weeks, they had made Sloane's life a calculated exercise in professional humiliation, and now their campaign appeared to have reached its intended conclusion. Sloane paused in her packing, not turning around as she responded with characteristic quietness. "Some battles aren't worth fighting here." Her voice carried no anger, no frustration, just the steady resignation of someone who had learned to pick her fights carefully. She lifted her duffel bag, the motion causing her sleeve to ride up slightly, revealing a small line of black characters tattooed along her left wrist. Commander Hayes happened to be walking past the open doorway at that precise moment, his attention caught by the commotion. His eyes fell upon Sloane's exposed wrist, and his phone clattered to the concrete floor with a sharp crack that cut through the afternoon stillness. The seasoned officer's face went pale as recognition dawned, his lips moving in a barely audible whisper that would change everything. "We've been looking for someone like you for 18 months. But that moment of revelation lay in the future. 3 weeks earlier, the story had begun very differently. The Naval Special Warfare Advanced Training Facility buzzed with the nervous energy of new beginnings as dawn broke over Coronado on a Tuesday morning in September. Salt air mixed with the distant sound of waves crashing against the shore, creating the perfect backdrop for what promised to be either the making or breaking of military careers. The experimental integration program had drawn candidates from across multiple service branches, each hoping to prove themselves worthy of joining the elite ranks of Naval Special Operations. Sloane Mercer sat quietly in the back row of the orientation briefing room, her regulation notebook open and pen ready, the same methodical preparation she brought to every aspect of military life. At 28, she carried herself with the understated precision of someone who had learned that actions spoke louder than words, and that drawing attention was often counterproductive to achieving objectives. Her dark hair was pulled back in a perfect regulation bun, and her gray eyes held the peculiar stillness that came from seeing more than most people her age should have experienced. If you're already captivated by Sloane's mysterious composure and want to see how this story unfolds, hit that like button and subscribe for more incredible military stories that reveal the truth behind the uniform. According to her official file, she had spent the previous 4 years working as a helicopter mechanic for civilian defense contractors, maintaining aircraft used in support operations across various theaters. It was respectable work that required technical expertise and attention to detail, but it hardly seemed like preparation for the intensive training program that lay ahead. Most of the other candidates brought backgrounds in infantry, reconnaissance, or specialized operations. Sloane's mechanical expertise made her an outlier in a group already selected for exceptional capability. The 3 men who would become her primary tormentors noticed this discrepancy immediately. Garrett Lawson, a former Marine corporal with linebacker shoulders and the kind of aggressive confidence that had served him well in more traditional military settings, appointed himself as the unofficial spokesperson for their group's skepticism. His voice carried the authority of someone accustomed to being heard when he spoke. "Look around," Garrett murmured to his companions as Captain Rodriguez began the formal briefing. "See anything that doesn't belong?" His gaze fixed on Sloane with the intensity of a predator identifying the weakest member of the herd. "Helicopter mechanic, civilian contractor, they're really scraping the bottom of the barrel to fill diversity quotas." Travis Keller nodded in agreement, his pale eyes scanning Sloane with calculated assessment. The former Army Ranger had built his reputation on physical intimidation and the kind of psychological pressure that could break lesser soldiers before combat ever became necessary. Where Garrett was loud and obvious, Travis operated with quiet menace, his threats delivered through body language and strategic positioning rather than direct confrontation. Mason Price completed their trio with the methodical precision of someone who understood that the most effective sabotage happened behind the scenes. His Navy background had taught him the importance of official documentation and proper procedures, knowledge he intended to weaponize against anyone he deemed unworthy of wearing the uniform. Unlike his companions, Mason rarely raised his voice or made grand pronouncements. He preferred to let his actions speak for him, and his actions were consistently devastating to his targets. Captain Rodriguez commanded the room with the easy authority of someone who had earned respect through decades of service in the most demanding environments the military could offer. His weathered face bore the kind of scars that came from real combat rather than training exercises, and his voice carried the weight of absolute credibility when he addressed the assembled candidates. Ladies and gentlemen, you are here because your service records indicate exceptional potential for advanced special operations work, Rodriguez began, his eyes sweeping across the room with practiced assessment. This program will test not only your physical capabilities, but your ability to adapt, overcome, and work effectively as part of a team under conditions that will push you beyond anything you have previously experienced. As Rodriguez outlined the program structure and expectations, Sloan found herself unconsciously noting the timing of various administrative details. The security rotation changed every 47 seconds. The ventilation system cycled at precise 3-minute intervals. The emergency exits were positioned to allow rapid evacuation while maintaining sight lines to potential threats. These observations came automatically without conscious thought, the way some people might notice the color of paint on walls or the style of furniture in a room. She had no awareness that her mental cataloging of tactical details was anything unusual. To her, such attention to environmental factors seemed like basic situational awareness that any competent person would maintain as a matter of course. The fact that most of the other candidates were focused entirely on Rodriguez's briefing, without simultaneously mapping their surroundings for strategic advantages, did not register as significant. When the formal orientation concluded, candidates dispersed to collect gear and prepare for their first training exercise. Sloan approached the equipment distribution area with the same methodical efficiency she brought to all logistical tasks, checking items off her list with the thoroughness of someone who understood that overlooked details could have catastrophic consequences. That was when Garrett chose to make his move. "What's that supposed to be?" he asked loudly enough to attract attention from nearby candidates, pointing at the small tattoo on Sloan's left wrist that had become visible when she reached for equipment on a high shelf. "Looks like one of those temporary tattoos you get from a grocery store machine." The tattoo was indeed small and somewhat faded, consisting of what appeared to be random black characters arranged in a line along her wrist. To casual observation, it might have seemed like decorative body art chosen more for aesthetic appeal than personal meaning. The characters themselves were not immediately recognizable as belonging to any common writing system, giving them an exotic appearance that could easily be dismissed as fashion rather than substance. Travis moved to flank Sloan's other side, his proximity creating the subtle psychological pressure of being surrounded. "Did you get that at some strip mall parlor while you were waiting for your oil change?" His tone carried just enough mock concern to provide plausible deniability while delivering maximum insult. "I hope you at least got a discount for bulk work." Mason's approach was more subtle but equally effective. He made a show of examining his own equipment list while positioning himself to overhear and potentially record any response Sloan might make. His presence created the uncomfortable awareness that anything she said could be taken out of context and used against her later, a psychological dynamic that effectively discouraged defensive reactions. Sloan's response was to simply pull her sleeve down to cover the tattoo and continue with her equipment check. She made no attempt to explain or justify the marking, nor did she rise to the obvious bait being offered by her tormentors. Her silence seemed to frustrate them, as though they had expected a more dramatic reaction to their provocation. "Strong silent type," Garrett observed with heavy sarcasm. "That's going to work real well when we need clear communication under pressure." He turned to address the growing audience of candidates who had gathered to witness the confrontation. "Hope you all don't mind carrying extra weight when our diversity hire starts falling behind." The first day's training exercises were designed to establish baseline capabilities and identify areas requiring additional attention. Standard physical fitness assessments were followed by basic tactical movement drills, weapons familiarization, and teamwork exercises that would form the foundation for more advanced training in subsequent weeks. For most candidates, these initial challenges represented an opportunity to demonstrate their readiness for the demands ahead. For Sloan, they represented something else entirely. During the obstacle course evaluation, she moved with an efficiency that seemed almost mechanical in its precision. Where other candidates attacked barriers with brute force or athletic ability, Sloan approached each challenge as though she were solving a mathematical equation. Her movements were economical, calculated, and devastatingly effective. She completed the course in the third fastest time despite being neither the strongest nor the most obviously athletic candidate present. More significantly, she completed it without appearing to exert maximum effort. Travis noticed immediately. "Lucky run," he announced to anyone within earshot as candidates gathered for post-exercise evaluation. "Probably had someone draw her a map." His dismissive tone carried the clear implication that Sloane's performance was somehow illegitimate, an accident rather than an indicator of genuine capability. But Dr. Elena Vasquez, the facility's chief medical officer, had been observing with the trained eye of someone who understood the subtle indicators of advanced physical conditioning. Sloane's recovery rate was exceptional. Her breathing pattern suggested training far beyond what would be expected from a civilian contractor, and her movement efficiency indicated familiarity with obstacle navigation that could only come from extensive practice. "Interesting," Dr. Vasquez murmured to herself, making a note in her evaluation records that would prove significant later. The weapons familiarization exercise provided another opportunity for Sloane's unusual background to manifest in ways that contradicted her official file. When handed an M4 carbine for basic operation assessment, she field-stripped and reassembled the weapon with the unconscious competence of someone who had performed the task thousands of times. Her weapon handling was textbook perfect, but more than that, it was instinctive. Petty Officer Blake, the senior armorer responsible for weapons training, watched her performance with growing curiosity. Civilian contractors might maintain familiarity with basic weapons systems, but Sloane demonstrated knowledge that extended well beyond maintenance into tactical application. Her sight alignment was perfect, her breathing control was automatic, and her trigger discipline was exemplary. "Where did you train?" Blake asked quietly as Sloane completed her assessment. "Various places," Sloane replied, offering no additional detail. Blake nodded, filing away his observations for future reference. In his experience, people who deflected questions about their training background usually had good reasons for maintaining discretion. The quality of those reasons became apparent later, through performance rather than explanation. Mason had been watching the exchange with predatory interest. After Blake moved on to assess other candidates, Mason approached Sloane with the kind of helpful expression that concealed hostile intent. "Nice shooting," he said with apparent sincerity. "Mind if I ask what kind of civilian training program teaches tactical weapon handling at that level? I might want to recommend it to some friends." Sloane's response was to focus on cleaning her weapon with meticulous attention to detail. "Standard contractor requirements," she said without looking up from her work. "Right," Mason replied, his tone suggesting he found her explanation less than convincing. "Standard contractor requirements." That evening, as candidates settled into their assigned quarters and began preparing for the weeks ahead, the three men who had appointed themselves as Sloane's primary opposition gathered to compare notes and plan their next moves. Their dormitory room had become an unofficial headquarters for what they viewed as a necessary campaign to maintain program standards. "She's hiding something," Mason stated with absolute certainty. "Nobody gets that good with weapons from civilian contractor work. Either she's lying about her background or she got training she's not supposed to have." Travis leaned back against his bunk, considering tactical options. Could be stolen valor. A lot of people claim military experience they never earned. Might be she's hoping nobody checks too carefully. Garrett cracked his knuckles with anticipatory satisfaction. "Then we need to check carefully. Real carefully. Can't have frauds making the rest of us look bad." Their plan took shape over the following days as they observed Sloane's continued performance in various training scenarios. She consistently demonstrated capabilities that seemed inconsistent with her stated background, but she did so quietly, without fanfare or apparent desire for recognition. This restraint made their task more challenging, as they could not simply point to obvious showboating or attention-seeking behavior as evidence of deception. Instead, they would have to create situations that forced her to reveal either her limitations or her true capabilities, either of which could be used to justify her removal from the program. The opportunity came during the second week's advanced navigation exercise. Teams were assigned complex routes through challenging terrain with specific timing requirements and checkpoint objectives. The exercise was designed to test not only individual navigation skills but also leadership capabilities and team coordination under pressure. Failure could result in immediate dismissal from the program. Sloane found herself assigned to a team that included all three of her antagonists, a development that struck her as suspicious but unsurprising. Military training programs often created challenging group dynamics deliberately, as part of evaluating how candidates handled interpersonal conflict while maintaining mission focus. The route began before dawn, with teams deploying into coastal hills under overcast skies that promised to limit visibility throughout the day. Navigation would rely primarily on compass work and terrain association, skills that separated experienced operators from amateur adventurers. The checkpoint sequence required precise timing and coordination, with penalties for early or late arrivals that could cascade into mission failure. Garrett assumed team leadership without consultation, his voice carrying the assumption of automatic authority. "I'll take point and handle navigation. Travis, you take rear security. Mason, you manage communications. Mechanic," he added with deliberate dismissiveness, "you carry extra water and keep up." Sloan accepted the assignment without protest, shouldering the additional weight of emergency supplies while her teammates distributed the remaining mission-essential gear among themselves. Her silence seemed to confirm their assessment of her as a weak link who could be relegated to support functions, while the real soldiers handled important responsibilities. They had traveled less than 2 miles when Sloan began to display behaviors that contradicted their expectations. As the team moved through dense brush, she automatically positioned herself to maintain visual contact with both point and rear positions while continuously scanning for potential threats or obstacles. Her movement was silent, economical, and tactically sound. More significantly, she began making subtle corrections to their route without calling attention to the adjustments. When Garrett led them toward what appeared to be the most direct path to their first checkpoint, Sloan quietly suggested an alternative route that would add distance but avoid exposed ridgelines. When he dismissed her suggestion with irritation, she simply adjusted her own position to provide better overwatch of the terrain he had selected. 20 minutes later, they encountered the exact type of exposure problem she had anticipated. The ridgeline Garrett had chosen left them silhouetted against the sky for nearly 300 meters, a tactical error that would have been catastrophic in actual combat conditions. Worse, the terrain forced them into single-file movement that eliminated their ability to provide mutual support if contacted by opposing forces. Travis, bringing up the rear, was the first to recognize their vulnerability. "We're sitting ducks up here," he called forward in a harsh whisper. "Need to get off this ridgeline immediately." That was when Sloan demonstrated her first clear deviation from expected civilian contractor capabilities. Without waiting for orders or discussion, she had already identified and began moving toward dead ground that would provide concealment while maintaining their general direction of travel. Her route selection was immediate and confident, as though she were reading terrain features from a detailed topographic map rather than making real-time navigation decisions based on limited visibility. "This way," she said quietly, her voice carrying the calm authority of someone accustomed to making critical decisions under pressure. 200 meters through this draw, then we can parallel the ridgeline under cover until we reach the checkpoint approach." Garrett started to object, his leadership role challenged by subordinate initiative, but Mason cut him off with sharp urgency. "Whatever. Let's just get off this skyline before we fail the entire exercise." They followed Sloan's route through terrain that proved to be exactly as she had described: concealed, tactically sound, and efficient. Her navigation was flawless despite the fact that she had not been given access to maps or route planning materials. She moved through the landscape as though she had traveled it before, anticipating obstacles and identifying advantages with uncanny accuracy. By the time they reached their first checkpoint, 3 minutes ahead of schedule and completely undetected by exercise evaluators, the dynamic of their team had shifted in ways that made Garrett and his allies deeply uncomfortable. "Lucky guess," Travis muttered as they prepared to move toward their second objective. Probably scouted this area during her off time. But Mason was watching Sloan with growing suspicion. Her performance was not consistent with lucky guessing or casual familiarity. She demonstrated systematic knowledge of tactical movement principles that went far beyond what any civilian contractor would learn during routine equipment maintenance training. More troubling, she seemed completely comfortable with the high-stress environment of mission-critical navigation under time pressure. The second checkpoint required them to cross a shallow river while maintaining noise discipline and avoiding detection by roving patrols that were actively hunting training teams. The crossing point was not specified in their mission orders, leaving route selection to individual team judgment. Most teams would likely select obvious fordable areas, making those locations prime sites for evaluator ambushes. Sloan studied the river from concealment for several minutes, her assessment process systematic and thorough. She evaluated current speed, depth indicators, bank composition, and approach routes with the methodical attention of someone conducting actual reconnaissance rather than training exercise planning. "Upstream 200 meters," she announced quietly. "Crossing point offers concealment from both banks, water depth consistent for silent entry and exit, current speed manageable for equipment protection." Garrett bristled at having his leadership authority usurped by technical recommendations from a supposed subordinate. "I'll decide where we cross," he declared with sharp emphasis. "You just worry about keeping up and staying quiet." The crossing point he selected looked tactically sound from their initial observation position, but Sloan had identified factors that escaped his assessment. The approach required movement through an area that provided excellent overwatch positions for evaluator ambush teams. The water depth varied unpredictably, creating potential for noise and equipment compromise. Most significantly, the exit route forced them into a natural choke point that eliminated options for rapid withdrawal if contact occurred. They had barely entered the water when the ambush commenced. Exercise evaluators had positioned themselves exactly where Sloan's tactical assessment suggested they would be. Overwatch positions that commanded the obvious crossing site with interlocking fields of fire that made escape virtually impossible. Simulated gunfire erupted from multiple positions as the team found themselves caught in the middle of the river with no cover and limited options for response. "Contact left, contact right, contact front," Travis called out, his training taking over as he attempted to identify threat locations and coordinate defensive actions. But their position offered no tactical advantages and multiple vulnerabilities. The exercise had become a demonstration of what happened when poor planning met skilled opposition. That was when Sloan revealed capabilities that definitely exceeded civilian contractor norms. Instead of freezing or attempting impossible defensive actions, she immediately assessed their situation and began executing what could only be described as advanced combat movement techniques. Her voice cut through the simulated chaos with clear, precise instructions that transformed their team from victims into effective tactical unit. "Smoke now," she commanded, her tone carrying absolute authority that bypassed normal command structure considerations. "Travis, suppressive fire on Overwatch positions. Mason, move to dead ground at 10 o'clock. Garrett, follow Mason and establish position for covering fire." As she issued orders, she was simultaneously executing movement that demonstrated training far beyond anything available to civilian personnel. Her river crossing became a controlled tactical advance that used available terrain features for concealment while maintaining the ability to respond to threats from multiple directions. The smoke grenades created temporary concealment that allowed the team to reposition from their exposed location to terrain that offered defensive advantages. Sloan's movement instructions were not theoretical suggestions, but practical applications of small unit tactics that turned their ambush scenario into a successful breakout engagement. By the time the exercise concluded, they had not only escaped the evaluator ambush, but had done so in a manner that impressed the seasoned special operations instructors conducting the assessment. "Outstanding tactical movement under pressure," Senior Chief Patterson announced as exercise evaluators emerged from their concealment positions. "Textbook application of small unit tactics and immediate action drills. Whoever took tactical leadership demonstrated advanced training and excellent decision-making capability." The praise should have been a team victory, but it created an immediate problem for Garrett and his allies. Sloan's performance had been so obviously superior to their own that denying her contribution would appear petty and dishonest. Yet acknowledging her leadership would undermine their entire narrative about her being an unqualified diversity hire who endangered mission success. Mason decided to address the contradiction directly. "Interesting that our mechanic seems to know a lot about infantry tactics," he observed with apparent casualness. "Must have been some pretty comprehensive contractor training." Sloan was methodically cleaning her weapon, her attention focused on maintenance tasks with the same thorough competence she brought to everything else. "Standard emergency procedures," she replied without looking up from her work. "Basic survival skills." "Basic survival skills," Travis repeated, his tone suggesting he found her explanation inadequate. "Right." But Dr. Vasquez had been monitoring radio communications throughout the exercise, and her trained ear had detected elements in Sloan's voice patterns that suggested experiences beyond what appeared in her official file. The tactical terminology Sloan used was precise and current. Her stress responses during simulated combat indicated familiarity with actual threatening situations. Most significantly, her leadership during the crisis had been instinctive and effective in ways that came only from practical application under genuine pressure. Medical evaluation scheduled for Thursday, Dr. Vasquez informed Sloan as the team returned to base. Routine assessment, nothing unusual. The appointment would prove to be anything but routine. Meanwhile, Garrett and his allies spent their evening debriefing, developing a new approach to their campaign against what they viewed as Sloan's fraudulent presence in their program. Her tactical competence made direct attacks on her military capabilities counterproductive, but it also raised questions about the accuracy of her stated background that could be exploited through official channels. Nobody gets that good at small unit tactics from civilian contractor work, Mason stated with absolute certainty. Either she's lying about her background, or she got training through unofficial channels. Either way, she doesn't belong here. Travis nodded agreement, his mind already working through possibilities for exposing what he viewed as deception. Medical evaluation might reveal training injuries consistent with advanced military service. If her file doesn't match her physical conditioning, that's evidence of falsified records. Garrett's approach was more direct. Or we make sure her performance starts matching her supposed background. Put enough pressure on her, and she'll either reveal what she's hiding or crack under the strain. Their plan would require careful coordination and institutional support, but they had 3 weeks of credibility building to draw upon. Their own performance had been solid, if unspectacular, establishing them as reliable team members who could be trusted to provide accurate assessments of their colleagues' capabilities and character. The medical evaluation took place on a Thursday morning that dawned clear and cold, with wind carrying the salt smell of ocean waves across the training facility. Dr. Vasquez had scheduled the appointment for early in the day before training exercises commenced, allowing for comprehensive assessment without the distractions of ongoing program activities. Sloan arrived punctually, her appearance reflecting the same attention to detail that characterized everything else about her military bearing. Her uniform was regulation perfect, her physical conditioning was obviously excellent, and her demeanor suggested the calm confidence of someone comfortable with medical examinations. Dr. Vasquez began with standard questions about medical history, previous injuries, current physical condition, and any factors that might affect performance during intensive training. Sloan's responses were complete and professionally appropriate, but Dr. Vasquez noticed that she provided minimum necessary information without volunteering additional context that might illuminate her background. Any previous injuries that required extended medical treatment? Dr. Vasquez inquired while reviewing Sloan's written medical history. Minor training accidents, Sloan replied, nothing that compromised long-term capability. Dr. Vasquez noted the phrasing. Training accidents was military terminology that civilian contractors rarely used to describe workplace injuries. The distinction was subtle but significant to someone familiar with how different communities described similar experiences. The physical examination revealed additional inconsistencies between Sloan's official background and her actual physical condition. Her muscle development was consistent with years of intensive physical training that went well beyond what would be required for helicopter maintenance work. Her cardiovascular conditioning was exceptional, suggesting regular participation in demanding aerobic activities. Most significantly, she bore several small scars that appeared consistent with medical procedures rather than industrial accidents. This scarring pattern on your left shoulder, Dr. Vasquez observed while conducting her examination, appears consistent with surgical intervention. Can you describe the circumstances? Sloan's response was immediate and seemingly candid. Equipment malfunction during training exercise required minor surgical repair. But her explanation raised more questions than it answered. The scarring suggested surgical techniques typically used for treating combat-related injuries rather than industrial accidents. The positioning indicated trauma that would be consistent with ballistic impact or explosive fragmentation, not mechanical failure of helicopter maintenance equipment. Dr. Vasquez made detailed notes but did not press for additional information during the examination. Her professional experience suggested that Sloan was concealing significant elements of her medical history, but the reasons for such concealment might be legitimate and related to security considerations rather than deceptive intent. Clean bill of health, Dr. Vasquez announced as the examination concluded. No medical factors that would compromise training performance or safety. But privately, she initiated a discreet inquiry into Sloan's background that would eventually connect with Commander Hayes' investigation and lead to the revelation that would change everything. As the weeks progressed, the pattern of Sloane's exceptional performance and her opponent's escalating harassment began to attract attention from training staff who were paid to notice such dynamics. Her tactical competence was undeniable, but so was the growing hostility directed toward her by Garrett and his allies. The breaking point approached as training exercises became more demanding and the pressure to identify weak links intensified. Sloane continued to excel at every challenge while maintaining her characteristic silence about her background. Her opponents grew increasingly desperate to find ammunition they could use to justify their assessment of her as unqualified and dangerous. That ammunition came in the form of fabricated evidence that Mason crafted with the methodical precision that had made him effective at administrative warfare. His plan was elegant in its simplicity: create documentation that suggested Sloane had compromised equipment security, then let the investigation reveal whatever inconsistencies existed between her performance and her stated background. The plan required careful timing, credible evidence, and institutional support from training staff who trusted their assessment of candidate reliability. All of these elements seemed to be falling into place as the third week of training drew toward its conclusion. Basically, what do you think drives someone to fake their own identity in elite military training? Share your theories in the comments below about what Sloane might be hiding. On a rain-soaked Tuesday evening, as candidates prepared equipment for the next day's advanced tactical exercise, Mason executed the first phase of his plan. He placed a small recording device in Sloane's gear bag, positioned to suggest she was conducting unauthorized surveillance of training activities. The device was sophisticated enough to appear legitimate, while being obvious enough to be discovered during routine security inspections. The discovery came exactly as planned during Wednesday morning equipment inspection. Senior Chief Patterson found the device while conducting his standard pre-exercise security sweep, a procedure that was routine but took on special significance when it revealed potential compromise of training protocols. "Whose gear bag?" Patterson demanded, his voice carrying the kind of authority that made experienced operators stand straighter. "Mine, Senior Chief," Sloane replied immediately, her response automatic and professional. Patterson held up the device for everyone to see, its presence representing a serious violation of training security that could result in immediate dismissal and potential legal action. "Care to explain how this ended up in your equipment?" Sloane examined the device carefully, her expression suggesting recognition but not surprise. "No explanation, Senior Chief. I accept responsibility for items found in my gear." Her response was textbook military bearing under adverse circumstances, but it also eliminated any possibility of mounting a defense against what appeared to be clear evidence of misconduct. By accepting responsibility without attempting to establish innocence, she had confirmed the apparent violation while providing no information that could be used to investigate the actual circumstances. Patterson's expression suggested professional disappointment rather than anger, the reaction of someone who had hoped for better from a candidate who had shown exceptional promise. "Report to Captain Rodriguez immediately. This matter requires command attention." As Sloane gathered her gear and prepared to face what appeared to be the end of her military career, Garrett exchanged satisfied glances with his allies. Their campaign had finally achieved its intended objective through methods that appeared completely legitimate and justified by actual evidence of wrongdoing. But they had made a critical error in their assessment of Sloane's background and the attention their harassment campaign had attracted from senior personnel who possessed information they lacked. The meeting with Captain Rodriguez took place in his office overlooking the training facility, where morning sunlight streamed through windows that offered a view of obstacle courses and firing ranges, where future special operations personnel learned to become something harder than they had been before. Rodriguez sat behind his desk, examining the evidence while Sloane stood at attention, waiting for judgment that seemed inevitable and final. "This is serious misconduct," Rodriguez began, his tone reflecting the gravity of security violations in military training environments. "Recording devices are strictly prohibited, and unauthorized surveillance of training activities represents a fundamental breach of trust." Sloane's response was immediate and unwavering. "I understand, sir. I accept full responsibility." Rodriguez studied her carefully, noting the discrepancy between her exceptional performance record and the apparent evidence of wrongdoing. Something about the situation felt wrong, but he had clear evidence and a candidate who was accepting responsibility without attempting to mount any defense. "Your performance has been outstanding," he continued, his voice suggesting genuine regret. This incident is particularly disappointing because it comes from someone who showed real promise for advanced operations. What Rodriguez did not mention was the discreet inquiry he had initiated into Sloane's background following reports from Dr. Vasquez and other training staff who had noticed inconsistencies between her official file and her demonstrated capabilities. That inquiry had not yet produced results, but it had raised sufficient questions to make him reluctant to take immediate action without additional investigation. "I'm suspending you from training pending full investigation," Rodriguez announced. "You're confined to quarters until this matter is resolved." Sloane accepted the suspension with the same professional demeanor she brought to everything else. "Understood, sir. Will there be anything else?" "That depends," Rodriguez replied, his tone suggesting that possibilities remained open despite the apparent evidence against her. "Is there anything about your background or qualifications that might be relevant to this investigation?" The question hung in the air like an invitation for Sloane to provide information that could change the trajectory of her case. She had been given an opportunity to reveal whatever she was concealing, to trust in the military justice system's ability to distinguish between appearance and reality. Her response would determine not only her own fate, but also the consequences that would eventually fall upon those who had orchestrated her downfall. "Some truths aren't mine to tell, sir," she said quietly, her words carrying weight that Rodriguez recognized but could not yet interpret. "The investigation will reveal whatever it needs to reveal." As Sloane left his office to begin what appeared to be her final day at the Naval Special Warfare Training Facility, Rodriguez reached for his phone to accelerate the background inquiry that had already begun. Something in her demeanor suggested that the truth would be more complex than the evidence indicated, and he was beginning to suspect that justice might require more investigation than appeared necessary. By late afternoon, Sloane was packing her few belongings into a regulation duffel bag, while Garrett and his allies watched from the doorway with unconcealed satisfaction. Their campaign had achieved complete victory through methods that appeared entirely legitimate and justified by documentary evidence. They had successfully eliminated what they viewed as an unqualified candidate who had threatened the integrity of their training program. The moment when Commander Hayes walked past and noticed her exposed wrist was still hours away, but the foundation for that revelation had been laid through weeks of careful observation by medical and training personnel who had recognized that Sloane's capabilities exceeded her stated background in ways that suggested concealed rather than fabricated qualifications. As she prepared to leave the facility that had become a temporary home, Sloane maintained the same quiet composure that had characterized her entire stay. She had fought no battles, mounted no defenses, and revealed no secrets. Yet something in her demeanor suggested that the story was far from over, and that truth had ways of emerging despite the most careful attempts at concealment. The final confrontation was approaching, though none of the participants yet understood the forces that had been set in motion by their actions over the previous 3 weeks. The duffel bag felt heavier than it should have as Sloane shouldered it for what appeared to be the final time. 3 weeks of intensive training had accumulated into this single moment of departure, her carefully maintained composure intact, even as Garrett's satisfied smirk burned into her peripheral vision. The afternoon sun slanted through the dormitory windows, casting long shadows that seemed to emphasize the finality of her situation. "Finally giving up diversity hire?" Garrett's voice carried the sweet satisfaction of complete victory, each word precisely calculated to maximize the humiliation of her apparent defeat. Behind him, Travis and Mason wore expressions of professional vindication, as though they had performed a necessary service by exposing an unqualified fraud who had threatened program integrity. Sloane paused in her movement toward the door, not turning to face her tormentors as she delivered what they assumed would be her final words at the facility. "Some battles aren't worth fighting here." Her voice carried no anger, no bitterness, just the steady resignation of someone who understood when tactical withdrawal represented the only viable option. She lifted the duffel bag, the motion causing her sleeve to ride up slightly and expose the small line of black characters tattooed along her left wrist. The marking caught the afternoon light for just a moment before disappearing again beneath the fabric, a detail so brief that it might have passed completely unnoticed under different circumstances. But Commander Hayes happened to be walking past the open doorway at that precise instant, his attention initially focused on administrative paperwork that required his signature before the day's end. His eyes fell upon Sloane's exposed wrist during the brief moment when the tattoo was visible, and recognition hit him like a physical blow that drove all other thoughts from his consciousness. The phone slipped from his nerveless fingers, clattering against the concrete floor with a sharp crack that cut through the afternoon stillness like a gunshot. His face went pale as memory connected with present reality, his lips moving in a barely audible whisper that would reshape everything everyone thought they understood about the woman preparing to leave their facility forever. "We've been looking for someone like you for 18 months. The words hung in the air like smoke from a discharged weapon, their implications rippling outward to touch everyone within hearing distance. Garrett's triumphant expression faltered as confusion replaced satisfaction. Travis and Mason exchanged uncertain glances, suddenly aware that their carefully orchestrated victory might have complications they had not anticipated. Sloane turned slowly to face Commander Hayes, her gray eyes meeting his with the steady composure that had characterized her response to every challenge over the previous 3 weeks. But something passed between them in that moment of recognition, an understanding that transcended the apparent circumstances and suggested depths of meaning that none of the other witnesses could comprehend. "Commander," she said quietly, her voice carrying the respectful acknowledgement appropriate for a senior officer while offering no additional information that might illuminate the mystery of his reaction. Hayes retrieved his phone with hands that trembled slightly, his professional composure struggling to reassert itself after the shock of unexpected discovery. "Brooks, report to my office immediately." His tone carried absolute authority that brooked no discussion or delay, the voice of someone accustomed to having his orders followed without question. As Sloane followed Hayes down the corridor toward his office, leaving behind 3 increasingly confused antagonists, the foundation began to shift beneath assumptions that had seemed solid moments before. The investigation that Captain Rodriguez had initiated was about to accelerate in directions that would reveal truths more complex than anyone had imagined. Dr. Vasquez was already waiting in Hayes' office when they arrived, her presence suggesting coordination that had been invisible to casual observers. The medical officer's expression combined professional concern with the satisfaction of someone whose suspicions were finally being validated by events. "The background inquiry you requested," Dr. Vasquez began without preamble, placing a thick folder on Hayes' desk. "Preliminary results raised significant questions about the accuracy of Brooks's stated background and the circumstances that brought her to this facility." Hayes opened the folder, scanning documents that painted a picture dramatically different from what appeared in Sloane's official training file. Medical records indicated surgical interventions consistent with combat trauma rather than industrial accidents. Psychological evaluations suggested exposure to high-stress environments that went well beyond civilian contractor experiences. Most significantly, there were gaps in her documented timeline that corresponded to periods when classified military operations had been conducted in theaters where she claimed no involvement. "The injury patterns are consistent with ballistic trauma," Dr. Vasquez continued, her voice reflecting the clinical precision that made her assessments credible in official proceedings. "The surgical scarring suggests treatment by military medical personnel rather than civilian facilities. The psychological markers indicate combat stress responses that are inconsistent with helicopter maintenance duties." But the most significant revelation came from Hayes' own investigation into classified personnel records that were not accessible through normal military channels. His security clearance and position within naval intelligence had allowed him to cross-reference Sloane's physical description and distinctive tattoo against databases maintained for tracking personnel involved in highly sensitive operations. "Blackbird 77, Hayes said quietly, his voice carrying the weight of recognition that explained everything while revealing nothing to unauthorized personnel. "Declared missing in action 18 months ago during classified counterintelligence operations in the Gulf region." The designation meant nothing to most military personnel, but Dr. Vasquez understood its significance within the special operations community. Blackbird operations were conducted by personnel whose identities were compartmentalized at levels that made them effectively invisible to normal military record-keeping. Participants operated under deep cover identities that were maintained even after operations concluded, providing security for both the individuals involved and the classified methods they had employed. "The unit was declared lost with all hands," Hayes continued, consulting classified records that painted a grim picture of an operation that had gone catastrophically wrong. 12 operators deployed, 0 confirmed survivors, mission parameters remained classified at the highest levels. Dr. Vasquez studied the documents with growing understanding of why Sloane's medical and psychological markers had seemed inconsistent with her stated background. If she had survived the operation that claimed her unit, she would have been placed in a witness protection program that provided civilian cover identity while her status remained officially classified as missing or deceased. "The tattoo," Dr. Vasquez observed, pointing to enhanced photographs that showed the marking in detail. "It's not decorative. Those characters represent coordinates and unit designation information that would allow surviving personnel to identify each other if they encountered each other in civilian contexts." Hayes nodded grimly, his expression reflecting the weight of discovering that someone officially dead was not only alive, but had somehow ended up in their training program under circumstances that suggested either remarkable coincidence or deliberate intent. Either possibility raised security concerns that required immediate investigation and resolution. "She's been hiding in plain sight," he concluded, reaching for his secure communication device, using skills that made her exceptional at training exercises while maintaining a cover identity that explained her presence without raising security flags. The conversation that followed involved multiple levels of military and intelligence hierarchy as the implications of Sloane's discovery rippled through classified channels. Her survival represented not only a significant intelligence asset, but also potential security risks that required careful evaluation before any decisions could be made about her future status. Meanwhile, in the dormitory where her apparent disgrace had played out hours earlier, Garrett and his allies were beginning to understand that their campaign against what they had perceived as an unqualified fraud might have targeted someone whose qualifications exceeded their own by margins they could never have imagined. The revelation process began the next morning when Captain Rodriguez convened an emergency meeting that included all training personnel and the candidates who had been involved in the investigation of Sloane's apparent misconduct. The assembly took place in the main briefing room, where flags and military decorations created a backdrop that emphasized the seriousness of what was about to unfold. "Gentlemen," Rodriguez began, his voice carrying the authority of absolute truth, "we have discovered that the evidence against Brooks was fabricated, and that her actual background differs significantly from what appears in her training file." The words hit Garrett like physical blows, each revelation destroying assumptions that had seemed unshakable hours before. The recording device that had provided such convincing evidence of wrongdoing had been traced to a purchase made by Mason 3 days earlier. Security footage had been recovered, showing him placing the device in Sloane's gear bag. The case that had seemed so solid was collapsing under scrutiny that revealed deliberate deception rather than legitimate security concerns. "The harassment campaign conducted against Brooks over the past 3 weeks," Rodriguez continued, his gaze fixing on each of the 3 men in turn, "represents a serious breach of military justice and professional conduct that will result in immediate consequences." Travis felt the floor dropping away beneath him as he realized that their carefully orchestrated plan had not only failed, but had exposed them to legal liability that could destroy their military careers. The evidence they thought they had created to justify their assessment of Sloane had instead created a clear trail of misconduct that implicated them in activities that violated both military regulations and basic principles of professional behavior. But the most devastating revelation was yet to come. Dr. Vasquez stepped forward to address the assembly, her medical authority lending credibility to information that would reshape everyone's understanding of what had transpired over the previous weeks. Brooks's actual background involves classified military service that cannot be fully disclosed in this forum, but which explains capabilities that exceeded normal expectations for personnel with her stated civilian contractor experience. The words fell like hammer blows on the 3 men who had spent weeks mocking what they perceived as pretended competence. Every tactical decision that had seemed suspiciously advanced, every demonstration of knowledge that had appeared inconsistent with her background, every moment of leadership that had challenged their assumptions about her qualifications suddenly made perfect sense in a context they had never imagined. "The unit designation tattooed on her wrist," Dr. Vasquez continued, "represents service in classified special operations that resulted in casualties and required surviving personnel to assume civilian identities for security purposes." Mason felt his world collapsing as the implications of their harassment campaign became clear. They had not been exposing a fraud who threatened program integrity. They had been tormenting a decorated veteran whose service record was classified at levels that made their own military experience seem trivial by comparison. The woman they had dismissed as a diversity hire possessed qualifications that surpassed their own by margins that made their mockery seem not just cruel, but absurd. Commander Hayes took the podium to deliver the final element of truth that would complete the devastating reversal of everything they thought they understood. His presence commanded absolute attention as he prepared to reveal information that would change not only the immediate situation, but the career prospects of everyone involved. "Brooks survived an operation that officially never happened," Hayes announced, his voice carrying the weight of classified information that few personnel were authorized to hear. "Her teammates died defending assets that remain critical to national security. She has spent the last 18 months in protected status, while intelligence services determined whether exposure of her survival would compromise ongoing operations." The revelation hit like an artillery barrage, each piece of information destroying another element of the narrative that Garrett and his allies had constructed to justify their behavior. The quiet woman they had targeted as weak had survived combat that killed trained special operations personnel. The mechanical skills they had dismissed as insufficient preparation were cover for capabilities that exceeded their own training by decades of equivalent experience. But Hayes was not finished. The final piece of information would complete their humiliation while simultaneously elevating Sloan to a status that made their treatment of her seem not just wrong but criminally negligent. "Effective immediately," Hayes announced. "Brooks is reinstated with the rank and authority appropriate to her actual qualifications and service record. Her classification status has been adjusted to allow limited disclosure of her background for training purposes." The promotion that followed was swift and comprehensive. Sloan's cover identity was replaced with credentials that reflected her actual experience and qualifications. The woman who had been mocked as an unqualified diversity hire was revealed to possess training and experience that qualified her to serve as an instructor for the program that had nearly rejected her. Garrett watched in stunned silence as insignia were pinned to Sloan's uniform, each decoration representing service and sacrifice that made his own military experience seem like preliminary training. The woman he had dismissed as pretending to be a soldier was being recognized as someone whose qualifications exceeded those of the instructors who had been evaluating her performance. The medical examination that followed revealed the full extent of what Sloan had concealed beneath her civilian contractor cover story. Dr. Vasquez documented surgical scars consistent with multiple combat injuries, psychological markers indicating exposure to extreme stress environments, and physical conditioning that reflected years of intensive special operations training. The shoulder injury, Dr. Vasquez reported as part of her official assessment, resulted from ballistic trauma sustained during the operation that claimed her unit. The surgical intervention was performed by military medical personnel under field conditions that did not allow for optimal cosmetic results. Each medical detail painted a clearer picture of someone who had endured experiences that went far beyond anything her tormentors had imagined. The woman they had mocked for her quiet demeanor had earned that composure through trials that would have broken lesser individuals. The skills they had dismissed as pretended competence were the product of training and experience that represented the pinnacle of military professionalism. The brief flashback that Sloan provided during her debriefing offered glimpses of the operation that had claimed her teammates and shaped her subsequent years in hiding. The mission had involved deep penetration of hostile territory to extract intelligence assets whose compromise would have undermined critical national security operations. When their extraction plan failed, the unit had fought a running battle against overwhelming odds while attempting to protect classified materials that could not be allowed to fall into enemy hands. "We lost contact with command 18 hours into the operation," Sloan reported with the clinical precision that characterized military after-action reports. "Extraction was compromised, and we were engaged by superior forces with advanced weapons and coordination that suggested they had been waiting for us." The battle that followed had lasted 3 days, with her unit gradually losing personnel while fighting to reach a fallback extraction point that represented their only hope of survival. Equipment failures, ammunition shortages, and mounting casualties had turned their mission from intelligence gathering into a desperate fight for survival that would test every element of their training and preparation. "Final engagement occurred at coordinates that are still classified," Sloan continued, her voice maintaining professional composure while describing events that had traumatic implications extending far beyond military failure. "I was separated from my team during enemy contact and was unable to rejoin them before their position was overrun." The guilt and survivor trauma that had shaped her subsequent years in civilian identity became apparent through details that painted a picture of someone who had escaped death through circumstances that remained painful to recall. She had survived not through superior skill or preparation, but through the sacrifice of teammates who had died protecting her ability to carry critical intelligence back to friendly forces. Recovery required 6 months of medical treatment and psychological evaluation, she concluded, her report encompassing years of rehabilitation that had prepared her to function in civilian society while maintaining operational security that protected ongoing classified activities. The consequences that followed her revelation rippled through multiple levels of the military hierarchy as the full implications of what had occurred became apparent to decision-makers who possessed authority to impose appropriate sanctions. Garrett faced immediate court-martial proceedings on charges that included harassment, conspiracy, falsification of evidence, and conduct unbecoming a military officer. His dreams of special operations service were replaced by the prospect of dishonorable discharge and potential civilian prosecution for activities that had targeted a protected intelligence asset. Travis received similar charges compounded by his role in the physical intimidation campaign that had subjected Sloan to treatment that constituted assault under military justice provisions. His Army Ranger background, which had seemed to justify his sense of superiority, became evidence of training that should have prevented him from engaging in behavior that violated basic military standards. Mason's methodical approach to administrative warfare, which had seemed so clever during the planning stages, became evidence of premeditation that elevated his charges to felony levels. His fabrication of evidence represented not only harassment, but potential espionage violations that carried sentences extending far beyond military punishment. Captain Rodriguez faced administrative review for his failure to recognize and prevent harassment that had targeted a personnel asset whose security status should have triggered protective protocols. His career advancement prospects disappeared as his superiors evaluated his judgment in handling a situation that had exposed significant weaknesses in their security procedures. The facility itself underwent comprehensive review as senior commanders sought to understand how their training program had failed so catastrophically to protect someone whose presence should have been identified and secured through appropriate channels. New protocols were implemented to prevent similar failures in future operations. Dr. Vasquez received commendation for her role in recognizing that Sloan's capabilities exceeded her stated background and initiating the investigation that ultimately revealed her true identity. Her medical assessment had provided the foundation for the inquiry that prevented a significant intelligence loss while exposing serious weaknesses in their security procedures. The broader military community learned about the case through carefully edited reports that emphasized the importance of recognizing harassment and the dangers of making assumptions about personnel based on limited information. Sloan's story became a teaching example used in leadership courses across multiple service branches. For Sloan herself, the revelation represented both vindication and the end of a chapter that had been defined by concealment and protective isolation. Her return to acknowledged military service provided opportunities to use skills and experience that had been hidden beneath civilian identity for reasons that no longer applied to her circumstances. The training program she had nearly been expelled from became the foundation for her new role as an instructor specializing in advanced tactical operations and survival techniques. Her experience surviving the loss of her unit provided insights that could not be replicated through training exercises, making her uniquely qualified to prepare other personnel for the realities of special operations. The small tattoo that had attracted so much mockery was revealed to be a memorial that honored teammates who had died protecting national security interests. Each character represented not decorative body art but commemorative information that ensured their sacrifice would be remembered by the person who had survived to carry their legacy forward. The dormitory where her harassment had played out became a different place after her true identity was revealed. New candidates learned her story as part of their orientation, understanding that assumptions about fellow service members could have consequences extending far beyond temporary embarrassment or misunderstanding. As Sloan settled into her new role, writing training protocols that incorporated lessons learned through experiences her students could barely imagine, she reflected on the journey that had brought her from hidden survival to acknowledged expertise. The battles she had fought in silence were over, replaced by challenges that allowed her to use her experience to benefit others who faced similar trials. The afternoon sun still slanted through the same windows, where her apparent defeat had seemed so complete weeks earlier. But the shadows fell differently now, illuminating a reality that had always existed beneath the surface assumptions that had nearly destroyed someone whose value exceeded the understanding of those who had presumed to judge her worthiness. The most dangerous weapons, she had learned, were indeed the ones nobody saw coming. And sometimes the strongest individuals were those who chose not to reveal their strength until circumstances made concealment impossible. Her story became proof that appearances could deceive, that judgment based on limited information carried risks that extended far beyond immediate consequences, and that honor sometimes required recognition rather than explanation. 6 months after the revelation, the Naval Special Warfare Advanced Training Facility had transformed into something unrecognizable from the environment that had nearly destroyed her. New candidates arriving for training received mandatory briefings about harassment prevention and the importance of reserving judgment about fellow service members whose backgrounds might be classified or compartmentalized for security reasons. Sloane's case became the foundation for these educational sessions, though her identity remained protected through carefully sanitized case studies that conveyed essential lessons without compromising operational security. The morning formations that had once buzzed with casual mockery and uninformed speculation now proceeded with professional respect that reflected hard-learned understanding about the dangers of assumption-based harassment. Instructors who had witnessed the systematic destruction of 3 promising careers understood that their responsibility extended beyond technical training to include creating environments where all personnel could perform to their maximum potential without fear of persecution. Garrett's court-martial had concluded with dishonorable discharge and a federal conviction that would follow him for the remainder of his civilian life. The former Marine who had appointed himself as judge of others' worthiness discovered that military justice extended beyond administrative punishment to include permanent consequences that affected employment prospects, security clearances, and social standing within veteran communities that valued honor above personal advancement. Travis faced similar consequences, compounded by assault charges that reflected the physical intimidation tactics he had employed against someone whose protected status made such behavior a federal crime. His Army Ranger credentials, which had seemed to justify his sense of superiority, became evidence of training that should have prevented him from engaging in conduct that violated every principle of military professionalism he had sworn to uphold. Mason's methodical approach to evidence fabrication had earned him the harshest sentence, as prosecutors demonstrated that his administrative skills had been weaponized against a classified intelligence asset in ways that potentially compromised national security. His understanding of military procedures, which had made his sabotage so effective, also made his misconduct inexcusable under standards that demanded higher performance from those with greater knowledge. The ripple effects extended far beyond individual punishment to institutional changes that addressed systemic weaknesses revealed by the investigation. Background verification procedures were enhanced to provide better protection for personnel operating undercover identities. Harassment reporting mechanisms were strengthened to ensure that patterns of misconduct were identified and addressed before they could escalate to dangerous levels. Training curricula were expanded to include comprehensive education about the diverse backgrounds and experiences that modern military service encompassed. Dr. Vasquez had been promoted to head a new program focused on identifying and supporting personnel who carried invisible wounds from classified operations. Her medical expertise, combined with security clearance that allowed her to access compartmentalized information, made her uniquely qualified to provide care for individuals whose service histories could not be fully disclosed even to healthcare providers. The program she developed became a model adopted by other facilities facing similar challenges. Commander Hayes received recognition for his role in preventing what could have become a significant intelligence loss while exposing security vulnerabilities that required immediate attention. His quick recognition of Sloane's true identity had averted consequences that might have extended far beyond individual tragedy to compromise ongoing operations that depended on the security of personnel whose survival remained officially classified. Captain Rodriguez underwent extensive retraining before being reassigned to a position that reflected lessons learned from his failure to recognize and address harassment that had targeted a protected asset. His career trajectory had been permanently altered by his inability to maintain the standards expected from commanders responsible for personnel whose backgrounds exceeded normal classification levels. The facility itself had been redesigned to incorporate lessons learned from the investigation that revealed how environmental factors could either support or undermine the professional behavior expected from elite military personnel. Physical spaces were modified to reduce opportunities for isolated harassment. Supervision protocols were enhanced to ensure that training staff maintained awareness of interpersonal dynamics that could affect mission success. Sloane's new role as lead instructor for advanced survival and tactical operations had evolved beyond traditional training responsibilities to include mentoring personnel who carried their own invisible burdens from classified service. Her classroom became a sanctuary, where students learned not only technical skills, but also the importance of supporting teammates whose experiences might be hidden beneath surface appearances that revealed nothing about their actual qualifications or sacrifices. The tactical techniques she taught were drawn from real-world applications that had been tested under conditions her students could barely imagine. Her instruction in stress management and decision-making under pressure carried authority that came from surviving situations where theoretical knowledge had been insufficient and practical experience had meant the difference between life and death for entire units. Her office walls displayed photographs of training graduates who had successfully applied her instruction in subsequent operations, their faces representing validation that her survival had served purposes beyond her own recovery. Each successful mission conducted by personnel she had trained justified the pain of losing teammates who would never see the positive impact their sacrifice had enabled through her continued service. The memorial tattoo on her wrist had become a teaching tool that illustrated the importance of understanding that military service took many forms, some of which left marks that were not immediately visible to casual observers. Students learned that decorations and awards represented only part of the story that defined military service, and that the most significant contributions were sometimes those that could never be publicly acknowledged or celebrated. Evening formations that had once featured crude speculation about personnel backgrounds now proceeded with professional courtesy that reflected institutional learning about the diversity of experience that modern military operations required. The cultural transformation extended beyond policy changes to encompass fundamental shifts in attitude that made the facility a more effective training environment for all personnel, regardless of their backgrounds or previous experiences. In the end, the truth had emerged not through her efforts to defend herself, but through the careful investigation of professionals who understood that reality often differed from documentation, and that the most valuable personnel were sometimes those who appeared least impressive to casual observation. Justice had been served not through her victory over her tormentors, but through the systematic revelation of facts that made their misconduct undeniable and their punishment inevitable. The facility settled into new rhythms that reflected lessons learned through experience rather than theory, and Sloan continued her work preparing others for challenges she hoped they would never have to face alone. Her tattoo remained visible, no longer hidden, serving as both memorial and reminder that some battles left marks that testified to survival rather than defeat.